the incredibly important things to understand about Shockoe Valley is how much change there has been over time. Some change is slow, some change is cataclysmic, but almost everything has changed. And I showed you this view taken from Church Hill in 1865, and looking west, it's actually not from Oregon Hill, but that's the title of the, everyone should look to Oregon Hill for guidance, I think. And this is that view today. And you can see there's almost nothing recognizable in that image. It's not that long ago, 140 years. What is there you recognize? And I show you this detail. This is a tiny little snippet out of this. This is looking at Broad Street. This is what's called Rutherford's Row. This is Monumental Church. This is 1865. Lock your eyes on Monumental Church and look at the same image today. What do you recognize? Monumental Church. Everything else has changed. And this is pretty typical of the kinds of change that we see across Shockoe Valley. So now when we look at Shockoe Valley today, we think about a neighborhood characterized by a lot of vacant lots and low-story construction. It's actually not at all its historic presence. So to make that point, I want to walk you down Main Street. We're going to start on Main Street and walk east. We're going to start at 1501 East Main Street. This is the Southern Literary Messenger building. This is where Edgar Allan Poe worked as an editor. This is where he first reached national acclaim. This is the site today. It's a very different kind of building. I'm not going to ask who's been in there. Between you and whoever you answer to. Poe would approve. Nonetheless, it's a very different place. And we move just down, just to the next block. In fact, watch these windows here. Watch those windows. There they are right there. This is the Jacob Lewitt and Son dry goods store. This is a photograph taken in the early 20th century. This is it today. Demolished for the construction of the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike, now called Interstate 95. Keep walking down the block. Still on Main Street. We're now in the 1700 block. See, now what I want you to focus your eyes on, start noticing the height of these buildings. We're going to see 3.5-story masonry buildings almost exclusively from now on. Watch this building. Watch this wonderful new tobacco. This is a brand new tobacco warehouse in this photograph is taken. That's all that's left. Everything else has changed. And typically, watch, every building has gotten smaller by a story. There's still masonry buildings, but instead of 3.5 and 4-story buildings, we're dropping to 2. 2 or 1 on almost every side. It's a great Union Hotel built in 1817 by Isaiah Rogers, one of the iconic hotels in Richmond. This is the site now. Nothing left. Nothing is reminded. Again, watch. We've gone from 1, 2, 3, 4 stories down to 2. And almost all of these changes happened between 1910 and 1920. We're looking at this great warehouse in the 1900 block of East Main Street. Again, 3.5 very tall stories. This is the site now. Main Street looks nothing like Main Street. Main Street is very tall, very dense. This was the nerve center of Richmond. Very different now. And I show you Union Row. You recognize this, the stone house, the old stone house. You recognize 1, 2, 3.5 story, right? Watch what happens. Bam. All gone. Including vacant lots, which is an important characteristic in the neighborhood as we move through. And one last one, this is the Ender's house, great warehouse. Again, 3.5 very tall stories, same site today. Dramatic decrease in density. I mean, we'd like to think of our historic places as getting more dense over time. Shockoe Valley's gone the other direction. Now, how about controlling floodwater? Or not controlling floodwater. This is 1870. This is looking back down Main Street again. We're looking between 15th and 17th, the same side of the buildings we've just looked at. And this is what happens when the James River would get angry. This is after Hurricane Agnes down. We're seeing the same tobacco warehouse. These are the effects. This is Main Street in 17 after Hurricane Juan in 1985. To address that, the city built, with the Corps of Engineers, the flood wall, which snaked through the city at enormous cost to protect this so folks could get insurance in Shockoe Valley, so the valley could be developed. Well, it sort of worked. So it worked until it didn't, and until it kept everything in and gassed on. But it worked to a point. But that's one of the great thematic issues with Shockoe Valley is how do you control floodwater, how much floodwater dictates development. I'm going to show you a map overlay here. What I've got in here just for reference, this is the previous ballpark proposal, but I just have that dotted in to show you where, just for reference. So these are the train tracks, this is Main Street Station, this is here. These are those two sites. So this is one of the earliest, this is again on the Mayo map. This is showing you the course of Shockoe Creek. Now, there's not going to be a test on this, but I want you to watch as I go through the sequence of maps over time, watch where Shockoe Creek moves. If you think it's in the same place it was historically, you're terribly wrong. Very early, as early as 1800, they're trying to channelize Shockoe Creek. And over time, Shockoe Creek gets straighter and moves to the east at a whole series of increments. And you see already here in 1835, you can see the map labeled Old Bed Shockoe Creek. The creek has already moved and is already being straightened. Continue even straighter. Segments getting straightened and straightened. This is 1865. Constantly moving this thing. By 1895, it's starting to go underground. And it's starting to go underground in the vicinity where Main Street Station would be built. By the time of the construction in 1905 of Main Street Station, this entire extent of Shockoe Creek is now underground, and it's under the station. It's under and around the station. And I'll show you in just a moment where that is. But this is the current location today. There are two stems coming through. There's a concrete pumping station here back that you'll see, but there are two branches to Shockoe Creek. This is all of the known locations of Shockoe Creek that we're able to map. And so it begs the question, when we talk about, one of the interesting proposals is daylighting Shockoe Creek. Well, the question is which one? And how? And it's been this great struggle to try to control this. And just to put it into perspective where it is, if you look now historically, this is again that stem line, the two lines of the Shockoe Creek sewer. It's a giant box sewer, a big concrete sewer that's actually embedded in the girders that support the elevated train tracks coming into Main Street Station. So it's actually this part, and it breaks, comes under broad. You'll see a little concrete pumping station here. One arm of it swings around, the other goes straight. So Shockoe Creek is actually part of the infrastructure of Main Street Station. And this is actually interesting. This was a photograph taken in 2008 when a building was demolished on North Andover Street. This is one of the concrete, the stone arches that's under the neighborhood that at one point channelized and moved Shockoe Creek through. And so we suspect these are all through there at the various locations where Shockoe Creek was brought underground. But it was just uncovered during demolition and it's been covered back up again. So, in conclusion, a lot of change, right? And the question is, how do we understand the pace of change? And the pace of change is what becomes an issue. Some things change very slowly. I'm showing here Mason's Hall, one of the earliest buildings, and it's continually occupied, owned and operated by the same lodge, built in 1785. This is the insurance policy from 1814, showing its original elevation condition. It changed quite substantially in 1871, received this nice portico, and that's the way it looks today. That's a pace of change we can understand in Richmond, right? Where things move slowly, deliberately, with all due deliberate speed. And it's hard. It's hard to change slowly. Or we have change like this. This is cataclysmic change. This is the construction of the Richmond-Petersburg Interstate, the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike, now Interstate 95. As we'll see later, this is what used to be 15th Street. This is where the site of many of the slave trading operations were along the street. It was completely and utterly obliterated from the face of the earth as this was brought around, swinging on Union Station. This is a pace of change that's hard to understand. It's not reversible. We can't go back on this. And it's that tension between those two levels of pace of change in Shockoe Valley that I'm looking forward to talking to you guys about tonight. So, to kind of take you backwards in time, this is looking at this lot today. So we see lots of empty lots, right? The big question is, what do you do with all these empty lots? Let's think about these things over time. Remember I mentioned I think Shockoe Valley is its lowest density now than it ever has been. Well, watch what happens to these exact lots over time. We start going backwards. Look at all these rail lines that were there in the 1920s. All these were functioning warehouses serving these multiple rail lines. As we keep going back further and further, in 1886, before the big warehouses, it's a smaller level of warehouses. We go back into 1876, which may be its densest period of occupation in its history. And we start to go back and watch the rails disappear. And even to the very earliest maps where I showed you in 1835, where you see they're already making infrastructure changes at the creek. And back to Mayo's plan showing you the original path of the creek, which takes us back to the end, to the beginning, which takes us to today. So what do we do with this today? What do we do with that information? And I'm looking forward to this conversation because I think Shockoe Valley is a very different place when you get up to a higher altitude and look down and start to think about what do we do with this going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bryan. I'll spend a few moments talking to you about what was going on here in the bottom? We know a lot about the slave trade. We've heard a lot about the slave trade in the bottom. But there was so much more happening in Shockoe Bottom that really, I think, many of us were unaware of. So tonight I'm going to focus a little bit on some of the findings from the study that we did for the city of Richmond back in 2014. Now this study, you're going to see some of the same images. This study was in support of the Revitalize Richmond project, which was proposed by the city. And our project boundaries included the farmers market, and then from Franklin Street up to Broad, and then on Grace Street on the, 18th Street on the east, and 16th Street on the west, and then came over to Oliver Hill Way, going all the way up to Venable, and down 16th Street. So this was the area that we looked at. Now, much of the architecture and much of what you saw in Bryan's presentation was along Main Street. Main Street was the main commercial avenue, and that's where you wanted to be for commerce. We're going to be looking at the interior, at the inside, the heart and soul, if you will, of Shockoe Bottom. As Bryan pointed out, the Mayo Plan, 1737, you can see where the project area is located in relation to the early plat of the city. We're right there on the edge, between the edge of the proposed development and Shockoe Creek. One of the things that we find interesting here is that there's a difference in nomenclature here. You've got letters, everything else is numbered. And that's been puzzling people for years. A lot of folks have postulated that the letters were added later, and that's why they were lettered instead of numbered. Other people believe that they have some different kind of use designation, and that's what that related to. But it's a question that really has gone largely unanswered at this point. Another thing we'd like to note is that the larger lots up to the north, of the north side of Broad Street, these were called estate lots. Higher ground, bigger lots. Same development principles in the 18th century as they are today. The bigger lots, the higher ground, the more expensive. That's where you wanted to be. The smaller lots down in the bottom, of course, were subjected to flooding. I think as Bryan pointed out, you see a lot of meandering of Shockoe Creek. Even from its earliest days, Shockoe never stayed in its banks. By the time we get to the early 19th century, this is the base map, 1835, mapping has taken on a little bit level of detail now, and we can get a better sense of some of the public buildings and institutions that are in the city. You obviously have development that's moved west across Shockoe Creek, but we have the appearance of the market building that's here that shows up, and then also the scale house, which is right behind it. This is Christ Church, which was formerly known as First Presbyterian, and then this is Seabrook's Warehouse. So you start to see really some more substantial commercial development taking place in this particular area. By the time we get past the Civil War, the Beers map of 1877, you're starting to get a level of mapping and detail that really gives you some insight to what's going on here. And again, the density of development is just absolutely incredible. I mean, you see houses, businesses lining both sides of the street. The market itself, this is the first market right here. You have extensions of the market going up 17th Street. You have vendors that are going to be lining both sides of that. And what I'll talk about here in a little bit later is we have housing that's actually on the inside of the block. And this was something that we found extremely fascinating and actually to some degree quite shocking and surprising. By 1924, when we get in the 20th century, the railroad dominates the project area. We lose a lot of infrastructure to the tracks coming in. It's replaced with, as Bryan mentioned, warehouses and depots. You have passenger depots, freight depots, beer depots that are actually located up here on the other side of Broad Street. And then we have the station and the other platforms that are down here within the project area on the western side. So let's talk a little bit about what was going on in this neighborhood, principally in the 19th century. I'm going to start with the slave trade. This is something that we focused a lot on during our study, but I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail here, but I want to give you sort of the high points. The slave trade was pervasive throughout the South and Richmond. And there's absolutely no doubt about it. It occurred on street corners. It occurred in hotel lobbies. It occurred in saloons. It occurred in houses, businesses. I mean, it was everywhere. Buildings here, these buildings are located on Main Street. They're not actually in our project area, but they're close to our project area. These were buildings where slave trading took place. Looking at them from the outside, you'd never know it. There's no sign hanging on the outside saying slave trade here, slave auction here. These buildings to the everyday individual look just like a regular business. It was hanging outside the building of a red pennant that signaled there was going to be an auction that day. So one of the things that we picked up on as we moved through this area in the records during our study, people didn't always advertise the fact that they were slave traders and that they were involved in this industry. And the closer it got to the Civil War, the less secretive it seems they became about it. So let's talk a little bit about where were the traders. This is a map that's a compilation of the work that Dr. Maury McGinnis at University of Virginia did and that we did for Richmond. And it identifies all the areas where there were known slave traders or individuals involved in the slave trade. Now, one of the takeaways here, and as Bryan mentioned this earlier, this is 15th Street. And as you can see, the greatest concentration of slave traders is along 15th Street and its various alleys. And Matt will talk a little bit about his work with at Lumpkins, and you'll get to see a little more detail about what physical remains of these types of industries. But by and large, the industry was centered here on 15th Street. Now, there were other locations, further west along Main Street, but then up in the project area, we also have a number of individuals and institutions, mostly along Broad Street. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. The two areas that we identified that really were clearly slave trade sites, they had the jails, they had the offices, they had basically all the infrastructure that you would associate with the typical slave trading facility at the time, were located right here at the corner of 17th and Broad Street. There was one on the west side of 17th Street and two on the east side. Now, as you'll all recall, if you remember, the Exxon gas station's right here, right now. That's just for a point of reference, so you know where you're at. For those of you who remember this area back during the flood in 87 or 85, there's I believe it's a Shockoe gas station that used to be on this side of the street, right here on the corner. So both of these areas we believe to have some level of subsurface disturbance. But by looking at all of the maps, the mutual assurance policy records, and also plats and wills, we were able to determine that there's a fair amount of structure that should still be here that's representative of this particular industry. Now, when we look at the people who were involved here, the names that you see are relative who's who of slave trading in Richmond during the 19th century. Ballard, Goodwin, Templeman. Goodwin is the individual who actually is associated with Solomon Northup, if many of you remember from the film. And, Solomon Northup's account, when he came to Richmond from Fredericksburg, as he came down on the rail line, he would have come into the station at 8th and Broad Street. And then he said from there he was taken to a holding pen between the station and the river. Now, when he was held in Richmond, it was 1841, and Mr. Goodwin actually owned property over on 15th Street. Actually, it was Birch Alley and Locust Alley off of 15th Street where Mr. Goodwin was located. So it seems like, based on the records, Mr. Northup was actually held over on 15th Street or Wall Street at the time when he was here in Richmond. There are a number of other individuals. Betts and Edmondson were huge traders, worked all up and down the coast here from the south, up in Alexandria, down to New Orleans. There's some names, Omohundro, that you'll recognize, Bolton and Dickinson, McMurray. All of these individuals were at various locations throughout the project area. There is one name I do want to highlight here, Robert Lumpkin. Matt's going to tell you a lot about Mr. Lumpkin. I'm going to tell you where he started. Actually, Mr. Lumpkin started over here on the east side of 17th Street, and he rented space in a facility, and there he was an itinerant trader. He would go deep down in the deep south, actually look for slaves, hook them up with buyers, and bring them back north. And so he started here, and then once he left here, he went and purchased the property over Devil's Half Acre that Matt will talk to you about shortly. So a lot of these businesses were extremely fluid. I mean, these individuals bought and sold property. They changed the ownership structure almost annually. I mean, frankly, from a historical perspective, it became a nightmare trying to track them through the years, because they would rent property from each other, and then they would sell it back to each other, and then they would move across the street. They'd move in and out of the project area. This is sometimes 2 times a year. So there was a lot that was happening from a business structure here that was really complex. But rarely do you find records where they're actually advertising themselves or recognizing themselves in city directories as slave traders. Again, it's something they kept very close to the vest and didn't talk about very openly. So slave trade was prominent. It was there throughout the 19th century up to the Civil War. But there was so much more going on in the bottom that we, frankly, didn't really know about. This is information we picked up as we were sort of going along the way looking for information on slave trade. Looking at the city directories, one of the things that that we found in looking at the city directories was, there was a tremendous amount of information about individuals living in our particular project area. Now, again, the city directories, it's almost like a phone book, so it's what the person was doing for a living, and it may also have referred to a business. So it's not necessarily a one-for-one, but it does give us a good idea of what kinds of activities and businesses were taking place, at least within our small portion of Shockoe Valley. We looked at the city directories for every 10 years. First year that we looked at was 1819, and what's interesting, or not, if you will, is that grocers represent over 60% of the businesses in the bottom, and it's because of their location. It's their location with the market. The market being there as early as the 1790s really served as a catalyst for the neighborhood and also for the industry. By the 1850s, what you can see is there's a large variety of different businesses that are taking place within just this small area, but still, it's grocers and butchers that form the largest proportion of businesses in the area. And again, they're all related to the marketplace. Now, one of the things that we were able to pick up in looking at the directories is a little bit of information about the individuals. The directories would actually distinguish between African Americans and whites. They wouldn't go into any other detail in terms of other ethnicities. But we were surprised to see this information, and we pulled it out and we're looking at it rather carefully during the course of our study. In 1852, there were about 430 free African Americans living in the city of Richmond. Now, in our particular project area, there were 34 that lived just within our project area. Free African Americans, 1850. This is on the eve of the Civil War. Their occupations were listed, and we even have their names, and we know where they live. By and large, the greatest number of individuals that were free African Americans were employed as washerwomen, located in the project area, working basically in a domestic capacity in households surrounding in the surrounding community. Where were they living? It really came down to sort of 2 areas. They were living on both sides of 17th Street, between Franklin and Grace, and they were also living off of 17th Street as you move up on the other side of Broad Street, so up by the distillery. Now, one of the things that really surprised us, and this was a piece of information that we had no idea existed, we didn't expect it, as Bryan showed you and as I showed you on some of the earlier maps, the level of detail about mapping is really sort of limited until you get up to about the Civil War. And once you move past the Civil War, you start to get a lot more detailed notations on maps about who's living where, what types of industries are taking place. This is a Sanborn map from, I believe, the 1870s. And what we found here were notations of tenements that were located on the inside of the blocks, and these were tenements for African Americans. We also found references in earlier deeds and also business papers where the businesses located along 17th Street here were renting out to free African Americans and slaves housing on the interior of the block. Now, what is unique here is in the 19th century, slave owners oftentimes, if they didn't have enough work, would send their slaves to the city to find work in the factories. And it wasn't uncommon for them to send a slave, basically with the charge to go negotiate your own rate. Whatever you can get, here's what I want at the end of the year. The rest of it you use to pay your rent, you secure your own lodging, and your food. So we have these communities that really have developed on the interior blocks. They're physically and psychologically separated from the rest of the world, but they're communities where you have both free African Americans and enslaved African Americans living together with some ability to make choice, not as much oversight as you typically would think in a plantation setting. And we believe this area really has a tremendous amount of potential for information about community, about culture, and interaction between the different races during this particular time. Now, as we move on into the 1870s and 80s, again, you can see the number of businesses really expand. There's a lot of increase in population after the Civil War. A lot of influx of immigrants that you see. Irish, German, Scandinavians are coming in large numbers, all starting out in the bottom. But again, what really dominates in terms of the type of industry here? It's food related. It's grocers, it's butchers, and hucksters. Everyone wants to know what a huckster is. Well, a huckster is basically someone who's selling anything they get their hands on off of a cart. It's almost like a junk dealer. And we've got images where you see them lining the streets, and they're lining the streets at the market, selling anything that's available, trying to make a living. By 1920, again, we start to see even more different types of businesses come in, but the butchers and the produce dealers still continue to dominate the market. And what this is telling us is that the farmers market, the market that actually the city, we've just now, I think, moved forward with sort of a new vision for the farmers market, has always been a catalyst for this area. I mean, it's been the reason for people living here and the types of businesses that they employed themselves in. It was the place that actually created the soul of the bottom in many respects. So let's talk a little bit about just some of the notable commerce sites. I'll just hit these really quickly. And the reason we picked some of these up is because they were in business for so long and employed so many different individuals. Crew and Son was a soap and candle manufacturer that was on the east side of 17th Street, just south of Grace. They employed free African Americans and enslaved African Americans in their operations. And they also housed them in the tenements that were behind their factory here on the inner block. They were here in this area from 1802 to 1911, so over 100 years. Made Dixie soap for the Confederate Army, which is pretty much the only reason they stayed in business throughout the end of through the Civil War. Tallheimers, sort of reaching back to old Richmond here. This is an image of Tallheimers on Broad Street. Couldn't find one up here in the bottom because it's, I think as Bryan has pointed out, we've lost a lot of fabric here in the bottom. But William Tallheimer came to Richmond from Germany in the 1850s. He opened up his first shop across from the market. And then in 1850, he moves to the east side of 17th Street, just south of the soap factory. He operates here until 1861, at which time wars in Richmond. You have a lot going on at Seabrook's warehouse. You have troops, you have wounded coming in and out of the area. Mr. Tallheimer moves his operation to the west, moves out of the bottom, and y'all know pretty much the rest of the story with the Tallheimers. Now, the public market is a really fascinating property and one that I think really deserves credit, again, for being a business catalyst for this particular region. 1780s, the General Assembly establishes a market down here at, in the project area of Shockoe Bottom. It was established primarily because of Shockoe Creek and its access to the river. Goods could be brought actually up Shockoe Creek. It was reasonably navigable at that time, but early on they did have to start dredging because it did become silted up. But the market was a place where not only did you vote, but the Hustings Court was located in the second floor. The cage, which was basically, it was a little public cage that if you were violating the law, you were caged publicly for a period of time. People could come by and throw fruit at you, whatnot. But it's always been, if you will, a mainstay of that. Seabrook's warehouse. Seabrook's warehouse is one of the larger industries that is located actually in our particular study area. As Bryan showed you, the scale of the architecture on Main Street, quite different than anything that you would expect, even moving further back up into the block. And as you move further south from Main Street, the architecture is even larger because of the industrial size nature of the different businesses that were there. But Seabrook's operated they opened up initially as a tobacco inspection warehouse in 1810. During the Civil War, it served as receiving hospital number 9. And basically, it was a triage station. Troops would come in, wounded would come in on the railroad, be taken to Seabrook's warehouse where they would be evaluated to determine whether or not they needed to go to Chimborazo or some other hospital to be treated. They didn't stay here. They really weren't operating on here if that could be held. Anyone that died here, though, their records actually indicate if you didn't make it out of Seabrook's, you actually went to the cemetery. That was your final resting place. But Seabrook's occupied this block for 100 years. So just like Crew and Son, I mean, they were a mainstay in Shockoe Valley. Once Seabrook's left, the building was torn down. It was an area that was used in the 30s and 40s by the city. There was a wading pool constructed there. And then following that, it was used to store sand by the Public Works Department. And then after that, it's been a parking lot. So this, from an archaeological perspective, is actually a very fabulous site because very little has happened to it. And it sits on one of the lots that's in one of the earlier parts of the city. But looking at Shockoe Bottom as a whole, what happened? How did we get to where we are today? As you can see, businesses in Shockoe Bottom starting in 1819, it was a steady climb. Even the Civil War hardly put it down, and the commerce and what was happening in the bottom. Immigrants following the war would come in and flood into Richmond, and they started at the bottom. Everybody seemed to start at the bottom. And then as soon as you got your legs and you actually were making it, you moved west. That just seemed to be the pattern, and in some respects, we're still doing it today. But right around 1900, 1920, things start to really drop off. Some of that is due to the fact that transportation changes. You have streetcars that really come in and enable people to move different areas of the city. Rail has really opened up different areas and opportunities for individuals. The automobile appears. So people start to have more access to other types of goods and can move outside of a particular area. Another thing that's important, and Bryan mentioned this, the train station covered up part of Shockoe Creek, not all of it. And as a matter of fact, the records show that the smell of Shockoe Creek had gotten so bad by the 1920s that the city was actually forced to cover the whole thing and put it underground. Remember, Shockoe Creek was open. You had Butchertown, which was north of Broad. Everything they did, they threw in the creek. Sewage was thrown in the creek. Stormwater, everything flowed into the creek. So I think it's not regulated like it is today. And because Shockoe Creek was tidal, it would just kind of move back and forth. Nothing would actually come out until there was a big storm event. So it really became a health issue, and one such that it really drove people away. And then by the time you get to the 50s, you have the interstate that comes in, and then we have the hurricanes, the floods, and Shockoe Valley, unfortunately, never really recovered. It never came back to the vibrancy that it was in the 19th century. Thank you very much.
So my claim to fame, such as it is that I spent a period of about 4 months standing in a very deep hole in the middle of Shockoe Bottom at the Lumpkin slave jail site. And while I was in that hole, I had a lot of opportunity to think about how the physical landscape of Shockoe Bottom has changed considerably over time. I thought about how the physical landscape affected the cultural history of Shockoe Bottom, and then again, in reverse, how did people adapt and then shape Shockoe Bottom to suit their own purposes? So that's a little bit about what I want to touch on tonight. And then look just generally, what are the ramifications of all this, the physical context of Shockoe Bottom in terms of its future archaeological potential? As Dave and Bryan have both alluded to already, Shockoe Bottom has changed considerably over the past 200, 300 years visually in terms of its built environment, but its physical environment has really changed quite a bit today. If you look at it today, it actually looks quite flat, quite level. We know based on our first-hand experience now, there are perils in assuming that an area is perfectly flat. We've looked at a lot of maps already. Maps are inherently two-dimensional. We're very lucky to actually have a and someone can correct me if this isn't right, but on the left, this late 1850s U.S. Coast Survey map, it's actually a topographic survey of Richmond that includes Shockoe Bottom. It's the earliest one that I know of. I know it's a little bit hard to pick up the topography lines on that, but if you compare it to a modern topographic map, you can see it's generally similar. But if you look, again, we've talked a lot about how Shockoe Creek has changed course in the Shockoe Valley, so this has obviously always been the lowest part of the Shockoe Valley. You can see Capitol here on the hill, and again, there's Broad Street coming down, so you see the slope here. But I think you probably just pick up the fact that they're actually showing this area right near the Lumpkins jail site, actually, as there's the convention there from marshy ground. So you can see that topography has changed, and then again, rising again as you get to Church Hill. So we have a little bit of an indication, even from these historic sources, that the landscape certainly wasn't as flat or as level or as regular as it is now, as we perceive it. Doing archaeology in urban environments, I'm sure you all know, is a lot more complex than, say, in rural areas. There are a lot of things that you have to contend with that make it just logistically more challenging in terms of interpretation. In some ways, it's difficult because obviously there's been an intensive use of the same compact space over a long period of time. So you tend to have, these different uses are represented by different layers building up. That can be very destructive depending on what goes on afterwards, but in some cases, as we'll talk a little bit about at the Lumpkins jail site in particular, it's actually served to preserve the earlier periods as well. So it really cuts both ways. Again, as Eric Sandwhite notably said, cities are messy places. Whenever you do archaeology, there are a lot of things that you have to contend with that you don't necessarily have to in other environments. Mary Beaudry, who's actually Dave's mentor, famously talked about the Pompeii premise in archaeology. Essentially what she was getting at is that you have to be very careful making assumptions about what you're dealing with, especially in urban environments when you're looking at archaeological contexts. This is just sort of pointing out that it's not necessarily as easy as this interpreting the archaeological evidence. Obviously, in areas that people have been using the same spot over time, it's very difficult, A, to distinguish between time periods as these areas are used, and also because you're in a compact urban environment where a lot of different types of people are sharing the same space, the material objects that they're leaving behind, the material evidence is all becoming jumbled up as well. So just kind of in comparison, if you were on a plantation in a rural area, you might have an area that was exclusively for the white plantation owner, then you would have a very separate quarter site for enslaved African Americans. You really had the room to kind of have different uses of space. In cities, you don't have that luxury. Many different types of people are using the same space, so it's very difficult often to be interpreting what you're finding in terms of the archaeology. I want to use Lumpkins Jail because I have the most experience with that particular site as a case study, also because I would probably argue that it's actually quite an anomaly in terms of the archaeology in Shockoe Bottom. We investigated this site in 2 separate episodes between 2006 and 2009, a preliminary study, and then a full-scale excavation, which many of you may have been able to see firsthand while this was going on in the latter part of 2008. We were hired by Richmond City Council's Slave Trail Commission to identify the site of Robert Lumpkin's slave jail, which operated between the 1830s and the 1860s. The site, the extension of what is 15th Street, south of Broad. We did a full-scale excavation and were able to find really amazingly intact and well-preserved physical remains of his complex, which included his house, a hotel, a boarding house where he could accommodate his clients who were coming from the Deep South to purchase slaves in Richmond's large Shockoe Bottom market. It included a freestanding kitchen, and most significantly, the notorious jail building itself, where Lumpkin would actually hold the enslaved people who he would bring to his facility to find purchasers for. This particular image, you can see, this is at about 7 or 8 feet below the level of the parking lot behind Main Street Station, which is now used by VCU for parking. We found this perfectly preserved area of intact cobblestone paving. We found this intact brick drain, which still drained water while we had it open during the excavation. So really incredible to get to that depth. This is an overall shot of the site. You can see Interstate 95, the embankment for it is right behind us to the west there. But you can see, so that there I am with my colleague Nick Buchetti, so you get some sort of sense of the scale and the depth that we were dealing with here at this particular site. So again, this is kind of the entire extent of the area that we were able to excavate during that 4-month period. This is that area of cobblestone paving, the footprint of the kitchen building, down here in the lowest part of the site. At this point, we were about 15 feet below the modern parking lot level. Found the remains of the actual Lumpkin's jail building. One feature which people don't really get excited about, but we found evidence, and this was completely unexpected. Running right along the site, right in the center of the site, there was a massive brick retaining wall, which divided the site really into 2 different levels. The first, or upper level, was about 7 or 8 feet below the modern landscape. And that's what housed Lumpkin's house, his hotel, the kitchen. This was essentially the white space of the site. Raised up, elevated. It had obviously been intentionally done this way. Had originally been a very sloping site, we assume, so they installed this retaining wall, were able to level this site, which fronted on Lumpkin's alley, and then down below that, step down another 7 or 8 feet on the east side of this wall, getting towards Shockoe Creek. That's where the jail building was, the lower level of the site. As Dave mentioned, this would have been the smelliest part of the site, near Shockoe Creek. This is where the enslaved people would have been held at Lumpkin's jail. There are a lot of accounts of the complex being surrounded by a tall brick wall. I actually theorize that it's this brick wall which people are talking about, kind of a demarcation between different areas, different uses in the site. So here you have, this is essentially a practical adaptation to the topography of Shockoe Bottom. You have a very sloping area here running down towards the Shockoe Creek. How best to maximize this valuable space? Well, build this retaining wall. So it has a practical function, but at the same time it has sort of a symbolic function as well, because it's dividing the site into its white and black spaces. And so that's where I think the landscape, the topography of Shockoe Bottom really starts to become significant, because here you have efforts of people to try to use that, to try to control it, but at the same time it's taking on this larger symbolic function as well. So why were we having to dig 15 feet down below the modern level of Shockoe Bottom to find it? Well, a big explanation for that is that in the years after the Lumpkin's jail complex disappeared in the 1870s, the Richmond Iron Works built an enormous factory, iron making facility right on the site. So again, you have this, it wasn't a sloping site anymore, it was sort of a staggered site. Well, in order to build the factory on this site, they brought in massive quantities of fill to level it out for the footprint of this building. That's essentially what explains why the Lumpkin's jail site remains are so deeply buried below the modern landscape. But ironically, it had the effect, rather than disturbing the site, of actually kind of encapsulating it, sealing it. So where in another part of the Shockoe Bottom that might not have been as sloping or as deep, a building like this with its massive brick foundations, which we uncovered, might well have destroyed any earlier remains beneath it. In this case, it was really the opposite. Just based on the topography, on the special characteristics of this site, they really had to alter the landscape so much that they essentially preserved what was below it. So sort of an anomalous situation. Thanks to Burt, we have this wonderful 3D rendering of what the site looked like based on our photographic evidence and more importantly, our archaeological evidence. So again, you can sort of see the distinction between the white, the public area of the site, and then the jail building itself, and just get some sort of scale of what the situation would be here. There's actually a lot of scholarship about urban slavery and making the point that because you're in close proximity to one another, white and African Americans, it's very carefully laid out these urban slave sites, how the space is used, and they talk about how the white space was sort of up in the public area, and it's very common on these urban sites to have enslaved occupants in the back, and it's often referred to as kind of down and in the back. And you really see that exemplified concretely at the Lumpkins Jail site. So here we are at Lumpkins Jail, over behind Main Street Station. I want to talk a second case. There have been really very few intensive archaeological studies within Shockoe Bottom. This other one, which was conducted by our colleague, archaeologist Lyle Browning, actually at the very same time we were working on the Lumpkins Jail site, he was working on what's called the Cedar Broad site to build a Cedar Broad apartments. So this is Broad Street at 18th. There's the McDonald's restaurant here, so if you're familiar with this block. In 2008, in preparation for construction of this building, he did an archaeological study of that block, which we were able to visit. This was really fascinating. Again, climbing out of our 15-foot deep hole, Lyle was on this site. He excavated down 3, 4, maybe 5 feet at the most, and he was already down into 18th century remains. So he had intact evidence of at least 2 houses dating probably from the 1760s, 1770s, and then subsequent buildings from the 1840s. And I think you can get a little bit of an idea from this profile here. So there's it's about 3 feet there. So again, only 3 or 4 feet deep in this part of Shockoe Bottom, and he's already down into the 18th century, where we had to dig 15 feet down to get to the Civil War era. So just to summarize, I think it's important to recognize, like we've already been talking about, Shockoe Bottom has constantly been evolving since humans have been using it. And I think that, if you go down there and look around today, there's not very much of that historic fabric that you can see, and I think it's important to recognize that, not only have the buildings changed, but the landscape has changed pretty dramatically as well. I think what's really most interesting about this is how people have adapted to that over time, how they've sort of made the best of it, but then how it's sort of influenced them and their cultural landscapes as well. I think from a practical perspective, I think it's important to realize, I think when people think about archaeology in the bottom, I think they naturally think about Lumpkins Jail, and I think there's an assumption, misapprehension probably that we've created, that you need to move massive amounts of soil in order to get to these historic resources that we're so interested in. I think that the work that Lyle Brown did at the Cedar Broad site demonstrates that it's not necessarily that difficult. I think a lot of the sites that Dave was talking about in his impact area, just given the varying topography in Shockoe Bottom, wouldn't be nearly as difficult to reach. So I think the archaeological potential of Shockoe Bottom overall is very promising. If we could have intact archaeological remains in a site like Lumpkins Jail, with so many different impacts that had occurred to it over time, and that be preserved, and then have physical evidence of 18th century remains just a few blocks away, I think that speaks very positively for the potential for future archaeological work throughout Shockoe Bottom. So obviously the more that gets done, the more we'll know about it, but at this point, based on what we've done so far, I think that there's a great future for doing archaeology and a lot still to be learned from seeing what's below the ground. So thanks very much.
Can we give another round of applause for these guys? I'm just going to ask them 2 pointed questions, maybe 3, and then we will get to your questions because I'm sure there are a lot based on what we've heard. First of all, we've talked a lot about European Americans, African Americans, free, indentured, enslaved. What about before that? We sort of arrived on this site in the mid-1700s. But Shockoe Valley existed certainly long before that. Can anybody talk to us a little bit about what that history might have looked like?
Sure, there are a couple of layers to that answer, and yeah, thank you, Burt, that's a great question. And one of the most obvious answer, there are kind of 3 layers to that, is that the Powhatan Confederacy, the village here, there were a series of village sites in this area. The one layer of the answer is that fall line sites are tremendously important trading opportunities. Because in order for moving anything by river, you got the rocks in your way, and you have to get out of the boat to get to either above the river, above the falls, or below the falls. So whoever controls that site controls the trade. The Virginia Indians understood that. They were here. That's why the Powhatan Confederacy had a village here. The English understood that. That's why William Burt owned a tobacco warehouse site long before Richmond was laid out. It's an incredibly important economic place to control. The other side of the question is the English were lazy. And they were really good at finding Virginia Indian sites and then moving in afterwards. When you read John Smith, he talks about how you could gallop through the forest on a horse. He didn't understand that was a very carefully managed forest by generations of Indians before he arrived there. He just thought, it's like going to Starbucks and thinking you invented coffee. And that's typical that they would come into these sites. Matt and I worked on a site like this recently, Smith's 100 down in Charleston County. It's a Pastor Indian village. And it was one of the second villages sent out after Jamestown, settled right into the same site in 1619. And we think something very similar happened in Richmond. It's a little tough archaeologically. We don't have that information. But the English typically would slide right into those sites. So it's very likely that this site's been occupied for a very, very long period of time.
Yeah, even going back into earlier prehistoric eras, which we really have no documentation about, we only have evidence from archaeology. But we do know, there certainly would have been an attractive area for settlement, just given the confluence of Shockoe Creek with the river. But we just haven't done enough archaeology in Shockoe Bottom to have found much, if any, evidence of Native American occupation. As you would expect, it would be going back thousands of years, especially along Shockoe Creek. So I think that's one of the really most underrepresented site types that we should be investigating or should be looking at in terms of pursuing future research. And you're only going to learn about that through doing archaeology.
Okay.
And I think one of the things to add to that, and Matt alluded to this earlier, talking about the challenges with archaeology in an urban environment. You're looking at hundreds of years of change, of destruction, rebuild, destruction, rebuild. There's a lot that's happening, that has happened in this particular area. Finding the evidence of prehistoric settlement or use of the area, it will be a challenge. It will be a challenge. You've got 250, 300 years of European use of this area that has left a pretty serious imprint. Now, that doesn't mean that it won't be there, but it means from an archaeological perspective, being able to identify that, you're going to need to be careful. You're going to really need to make sure that what you do find, that you look at it very carefully, because there's not going to be a whole lot of it left.
Okay. Well, I want to open this up now to questions from the audience. And I'm going to come back and close up at the end. So if I could get, if you have questions, to start with raise your hand. We'll stand up each time. Mr. Jordan.
Well, as a lazy Englishman who slid into Shockoe, I'm interested in the delineation between Shockoe Smith and Shockoe Bottom. Why is it where it is? What was there? Was it a demographic? Was it a economic separation?
Take a quick round. And I should say that the English were very tasteful. The distinction between the two, between Shockoe Slip and what we call Shockoe Bottom. Shockoe Bottom is a term that we really don't see used much until it's really late. It's not really the story. Shockoe Valley was really the term for that. And Shockoe Slip is applied because the slip was before the interstate, when the canal was there, you could actually beach lighters and the tow right in the slip. It was an actual slip. So it comes from its designation as a landing, offloading place into the warehouses and trading facilities in and around what we now call Shockoe Slip. And I think the bottom, late 19th century, we started seeing that term used. It's not that, or even more recent, it's not very old. And I think it's just referred because it's a low-lying area, but it's not a historic term. Shockoe Valley, even as late as the 1940s, you see it referred to pretty consistently as the Shockoe Valley. Everything from Scotland is referred to as Shockoe Valley and everything that you wrote. That's the more correct term. Does that answer your question?
Sort of, huh? We keep on finding we want to call it Shockoe, and there shouldn't be that separation, but
I see a hand in the back.
What does Shockoe
I got a speculation from the audience that it means flat rock.
Well, that was what I was told on the tour, but,
Are there other questions right now? Yes.
Between the Lumpkin site and the large field on the other side of Broad Street, there is an arch tunnel. Can you tell me the history of that arch tunnel?
That train tunnel, the train tunnel.
The train tunnel?
It's right underneath Broad Street.
Yeah,
Between Lumpkins and the slave cemetery area.
Under Broad Street, there was originally a spur line that ran there to the Seaboard building. The Seaboard building, a portion of it's still there. Yeah, it was a siding.
The train tunnel. Okay, thank you.
And the Seaboard building was on the north side of the road. True statement I'm asking.
Seaboard building was about double the length of it as it is now. So that surviving section actually has several segments. And the northern part of it was demolished, I think, in the late 50s.
So both sides were?
No, just on the south.
South.
Just south.
Thank you.
What was that, you said you talked about that architecturally the buildings became shorter. Was that economics? Was that the main reason why?
Yeah, the question is, why did the buildings get shorter in the early 20th century? It's a really good question. I chased that thing around for a long time. I couldn't find, I thought maybe it has to do with the insurance requirement. The underwriting requirements are changing. That didn't seem to be it. I looked into city zoning. It didn't seem to be related, though that is the time period when, for the first time, the city starts to apply the newly developed what they call industrial zoning to Shockoe Valley. And it's the first time that the city starts to redline the neighborhood. They start to actually identify on the city zoning maps, these are African-American neighborhoods and blocks in Shockoe Valley, and they're labeled as not suitable for development. And they're starting to cordon off parts of the valley. And that's more the northern parts of Shockoe Valley, not down on Main Street. And I looked into, is there a correlation of flood damage? I mean, these buildings get damaged by a flood, we're at the back end of the flood cycle, and so they're being replaced. And I can't figure it out, because the buildings, the puzzling part to me is that the replacement buildings are also masonry buildings. You know, they're not insubstantial buildings. And so, and I'm not sure why. The buildings they're replacing, they don't seem to be, I couldn't find fires, I couldn't find, you know, I can't find a systemic reason why you would see it. And it's puzzling, other than you saw the graph that Dave showed, where you just see the number of businesses in the neighborhood plummet and fall off. Now, the part that puzzles me is when people lose jobs and businesses relocate, you don't relocate by building a smaller building on the side of the business that failed. And that's where I'm kind of stymied with that.
Because of the taxes are based on the, a lot of times they raise the tax structure as you're in more limits and levels.
Sure. Yeah, and I've heard that sometimes when people ask it, is it because you pay, percentage taxes? But then it comes back to some of the same failing business analogy. If you're ever paying your taxes, how do you come up with capital to demolish a building and replace it with a new one? You know, you're incurring more of a capital expense by doing that. I don't know, and I'm not. I looked into that one too, and I couldn't find any change in the tax structure. They didn't change their assessment. You know, they weren't suddenly now taxing by number of floors instead of square foot.
So,
I don't know.
yes.
How much of the area was burned?
I mean, actually, this part of the one wasn't burned, wasn't workable at all.
You said the bottom was not.
Now, in the 18th century, I mean, there were two fires. There was one in 78 that really hit this area hard. I think there was another one right at the turn of the century that was also pretty devastating. And that was, I mean, you see a big shift from frame to masonry, throughout that period as well. But as far as the Civil War, if you look at the burn maps of the Civil War, this area wasn't burned.
One more question, and then,
Oh, mine's a little basic.
please.
I keep hearing about Shockoe Creek. How wide was this thing and how deep was it? Anyone?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I mean, it was navigable up to a point. I mean, they could bring, as Bryan mentioned, and also as noted in the records, in the early 19th century, they could bring lighters up to where the market was. So, I mean, it was deep enough that you could get a flat bottom boat up to at least sort of the Main Street area.
And you probably buried a lot and going flooding.
I mean, the trouble that they had with the creeks well thought.
And the problem really was the spring flooding was always the problem. The spring floods would come down and blow out the bridges that connected Shockoe Valley across into the western city. They blow them out every year. Council would pass a resolution about build it next time out of stone, and they build it out of wood. And they get blown out the next year. And there was a site where they finally built them on stone. But those connections were really tenuous. And the floods were extreme. I mean, it's just like we saw in Gaston. When the water builds up and comes down from the north, there's a lot of water. So even though the creek was maybe, 15 feet, well, it wasn't very large. When it flooded in the spring, it was massive and powerful and did a lot of damage on its way through. So it didn't look that big, but there was a lot of velocity in the flood.
So we have one more. Yes, sir.
So there are some in the local community who believe that parts of Shockoe Bottom should be reimagined as a site of conscience. And I wonder whether the panel could share with us their thoughts on how the information they've gathered and they've shared with us tonight, how that kind of information can be used to help reimagine this place as a site of conscience. How what you've learned through your research can be interpreted so others can understand this place. Thank you.
So you're focused obviously more on its slave trading connections. That would be the source of its significance as a site of conscience.
I mean, I can start, Ron. I mean, I think that's an excellent question, and it's one that I think as a community we've spent a lot of time thinking about, and more time recently researching and trying to understand. And as I pointed out and hopefully communicated, one of the things that shocked us really was sort of the richness and complexity of this community beyond the slave trading, and certainly not to diminish that, but there was, I believe, a very powerful free African American community that lived really side by side with enslaved African Americans as well as other members of the community throughout the 19th century. So what struck me is that it's not simple in any stretch of the imagination. And really, while the bottom can be characterized as an area of pain and suffering, and rightly so, it's also it's an area of opportunity, and always has been an area of opportunity for people to start and to really try to create their own way, and then to move on from there. So, I think the challenge with recognizing this community is to find a balance that both appropriately looks at it as a place of conscience and memorializes the suffering that went here, but also at the same time it celebrates opportunity and diversity in this neighborhood throughout its life. I mean, it's far more complex than I think we ever imagined, and I think that's something that we should try to find a way to embrace.
Dr. Laird, Dr. Green, do you want to weigh in on that one?
I mean, the point I would make too is I think that just based on my experience with the Lumpkins jail site itself, I think authenticity in terms of the fact that, we've demonstrated that there are physical remains associated with this very difficult slave trading history that persists, that survive. I'm sure Lumpkins isn't the only site that could be investigated too. So I think when we're talking about it as a site of conscience, I think it's important. I think it's very powerful to people and very meaningful to actually know and to expose those physical remains. And this is the conversation that we've been having with the public over the past few months as part of the Richmond Speaks. Now, knowing that we have this physical, this archaeological remains of this period, of this time period which we're talking about, how do we best preserve those and make them accessible to people as a point of discussion?
And I think, from my point of view, what I think is one of the interesting challenges is how do you knit this back better into the fabric of the city? The rail lines cut it off from the city, the interstate is cut it off from the city. It's very isolated. This was the center of town. The market was there. That was the center of the town. The first two bridges in the town were there. The town square was on 17th Street. This is where the heart of the city. And so these things that we're talking about commemorating weren't in the back of the beyond. They were 10 steps from the front door. And I think our challenge, one of our challenges urbanistically, how do we tie this back into the city better? How do we get people there? How do we get Shockoe Valley back in the middle of things instead of this sort of depopulated, de-densified area? So it's not, so whatever commemoration happens is part of the vital day-to-day life of Richmond. It's not a place that you have to go to see something. It's a place that you are. And so that's what I think of these threads.
I'm going to use my prerogative here and just sort of tag on to that. So, if I may. So again, as you guys illustrated, there is a stratum of what is actually physically there and what is culturally represented, what is missing. So I think it's very complex, as you noted. So in sort of retelling this or trying to capture this, are there other aspects that we should be looking at? I mean, as we've all noticed, sort of our focus has been pretty singular, almost, in a point of history. Are there other things that merit bringing to the surface? I won't ding you for it.
I mean, obviously, we're focused on the 19th century because obviously the slave trade was such a focal point in Shockoe Valley, but I'm talking about a relatively limited period of time. It was really in the center of the slave trade period of 30 or 40 years. And it's very important. It needs to be investigated. But at the same time, we have a lot more other forms of evidence of it in terms of photographs and documents. There are a lot of periods, earlier periods of Richmond history, which we have much less documentation on, and so have much more potential in some ways to learn about new information, through archaeological studies and that sort of thing too. So while that 19th century is obviously very significant and deserves focus, I think that there are other, the colonial period in Richmond. We really don't know very much about how the city physically developed in the second half of the 18th century. Or before, we talked about Native Americans already. These are all time periods which were important in the formation and development of Richmond, which, as you go back further in time, we have less and less information to go on.
And I think to underscore Matt's point, this is the one place in the city of Richmond where we can start with prehistory and follow the thread straight through to today. You've got that continuum of history here from the beginning to right now. And there are very few places in the city you can actually do that. So, talk about sense of place. This is it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to our brave panel for sharing so much fascinating information with us. We hope everyone can see why we think that the Shockoe Valley is a very important part of Richmond and why its history is unique and complex. And we hope you've learned something tonight, and we hope you will come join us for our next lecture on April 7th, Thursday, April 7th, on classical design in downtown Richmond with Calder Loth here at the branch. So thank you, and please join us in the hallway to continue the reception. Thank you.